The rain in Boston had a way of seeping into your bones. It was a persistent gray drizzle that clung to the red brick buildings, slicked the cobblestones until they gleamed like polished slate, and dripped from the bare branches of the elms in the common. For 22 years, Lydia Hart had known that rain. It was the sound of her childhood, the backdrop to her quiet, ordered life, a life that had felt increasingly like a well-appointed cage. The rattle of the train was a different kind of sound altogether. It was a relentless, rhythmic clatter of iron on iron, a forward momentum so powerful it seemed to be pulling the entire country west with it. For 3 days, that sound had been her world. 3 days of watching the landscape flatten and widen, the tight, green hills of the east giving way to endless plains of dun-colored grass that stretched to a horizon so vast it made her feel impossibly small. The sky was no longer a sliver seen between buildings but an immense, domed ceiling of piercing blue. The air that seeped through the window frames was no longer damp and heavy with the smell of coal smoke and the sea. It was thin, dry, and carried the sharp, clean scent of pine and dust and distance. Tucked inside her reticule was the letter. Its crisp folds felt heavy, a legal document that weighed more than any stone. It was a contract, an agreement drafted by her father's lawyer and another man, a stranger whose name was Boone Calder. It was a settlement of debts, a transaction as cold and final as the sale of property. Her father, a man whose charm had always outpaced his sense, had finally gambled away the last of their security, and Lydia was the final coin tossed onto the table to make it right. She closed her eyes, the trains rocking a ceaseless cradle, and heard her mother's voice, thin as a whisper in her memory. It was from the last week, when the consumption had taken all but her spirit. Live to live. Lydia, her mother had said, her hand cool on Lydia's own. Do not just endure. A simple command, yet it felt like a monumental task. Enduring was what she had been raised to do. Endure her father's follies. Endure the quiet pity of Boston society. Endure the slow shrinking of her world. Now she was being sent to endure a new life, a new man, in a place that sounded more like an idea than a destination. Montana Territory. The name itself felt wild and untamed on her tongue. The train whistle shrieked, a long, mournful cry that echoed across the plains. The conductor, a man with a walrus mustache and kind, tired eyes, passed down the aisle. Ash Creek, miss, next stop. Lydia's heart gave a sharp, painful knock against her ribs. She smoothed the front of her traveling dress, a sensible navy wool that was already coated in a fine layer of dust. She was presentable. She was composed. She would endure. Ash Creek was not so much a town as a suggestion of one. 24 wooden buildings, most of them unpainted and weathered to the color of old bone, lined a single wide street of packed, red earth. A blacksmith's hammer rang out with a steady, metallic rhythm. The air smelled of horses and wood smoke. A few men on the boardwalk of the general store stopped their conversation to watch the train hiss to a stop, their faces curious and unreadable under the brims of their hats. It was a world stripped of all pretense, raw and exposed under the enormous sky. This was not a place for enduring. This was a place for surviving. She gathered her valise and her reticule, her hands steady despite the tremor deep inside her. As she stepped down from the carriage, the red dust puffed up around the hem of her dress. The sun was warm on her head, a dry, penetrating heat unlike the humid warmth of a Boston summer. For a moment, she simply stood on the platform, a solitary figure in navy wool, feeling the stares of the townspeople like a physical touch. 2 men leaning against the station wall were watching her with particular interest. One was burly, with a grimy beard, the other leaner, with eyes that seemed to miss nothing. They were rough, and their gazes made her skin prickle. Then another man stepped out of the station master's office. He was tall, taller than she had expected, with broad shoulders that filled out his simple cotton shirt. He moved with a quiet economy, no wasted motion. His face was angular, tanned by the sun, with a seriousness in his eyes that was not unkind. He stopped a few feet from her, holding his hat in both hands, turning the brim over and over as if he did not quite know what to do with it. This had to be him. Boone Calder. He looked to be just past 30, a man settled into his own skin, yet there was a flicker of something in his expression, a polite awkwardness that she did not expect. Miss Hart. His voice was low and steady, a baritone that seemed to suit the vast, quiet landscape. "Mr. Calder," she replied, her own voice sounding small and formal in the open air. He nodded, his eyes meeting hers for a brief second before glancing away at the dusty street. "It is a long journey." "It is." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. He seemed to be searching for the right words, a task that clearly did not come easily. The two men by the wall snickered, and the burly one spoke just loud enough to be heard across the platform. "Looks like Calder's mail-order bride finally showed up. Cost you a pretty penny, Boone." Boone Calder's jaw tightened, a subtle shift of muscle, but he did not turn. The leaner man added, his voice laced with a lazy sort of malice, "Reddick was asking after you, wondering if you'd reconsidered his offer on those water rights. Says a man with a new wife has new expenses. More to lose." Lydia felt a chill despite the sun's warmth. The words were a clear threat, though she could not grasp their full meaning. Water rights. Reddick. The names were foreign, but the tone was universal. Boone ignored them. He finally looked back at Lydia, his gaze direct. The awkwardness was gone, replaced by a quiet resolve. He took a half-step closer, and in the space of that dusty platform, with the eyes of the town upon them, he made a promise. It was not a vow of love or a declaration of passion. It was something simpler, something that felt far more real. "I'll be kind," he said, his voice low and for her alone. He paused, as if to make sure she understood the weight of the words. "That's my promise." 7 words. They settled over her, a strange and unexpected comfort. Kindness was not something she had been offered in this transaction. It had not been written into the contract. "I will retrieve your trunk," he said, his tone shifting back to something more practical. He gestured toward a buckboard wagon hitched nearby. "My ranch is a few miles out of town." As he loaded her heavy trunk onto the back of the wagon, his movement strong and efficient, Lydia risked a glance at the two men. They were still watching, their expressions a mixture of amusement and contempt. They were not just idle gossips. They were messengers. Someone named Reddick wanted something from this quiet, serious man, and her arrival was now part of the equation. The ride to the ranch was mostly silent. The wagon wheels crunched over the dry earth, and the landscape unfolded around them, a panorama of rolling hills covered in sagebrush and dotted with clusters of pine. Lydia sat straight on the hard wooden seat, her hands folded in her lap, studying the man beside her. He held the reins with a loose, confident grip, his attention on the team of horses and the road ahead. He did not seem to feel the need to fill the silence with chatter, and for that, she was grateful. Finally, as they crested a small hill, he spoke without looking at her. "The house is just ahead, in the valley." She saw it then, a simple, sturdy-looking house built of timber, with a wide porch and smoke curling from a stone chimney. It was nestled in a small valley, protected by a stand of cottonwood trees along a creek bed. Barns and corrals stood nearby, all of it neat and well-tended. It looked peaceful. It looked like a home. When he pulled the team to a halt in front of the house, he did not immediately move to help her down. He set the brake, wrapped the reins, and turned on the seat to face her. "Miss Hart," he began, his gaze steady. "Lydia, this was a business arrangement, made between your father and me. It was not made by you." She simply nodded, waiting. "My promise to be kind stands," he continued, "and that means this. There is a room prepared for you. It is your own. The door has a lock. You will not be bothered. This is your home now if you choose it, but I will not force the terms of that letter on you." Lydia stared at him, trying to parse his meaning. "I do not understand." "I need help on this ranch," he said plainly. "I need a partner, not just a wife, a partner. We can work together. We can see if we can build something here. The marriage, the part from the letter, that can wait. It will wait until you are ready, if you are ever ready. We will be partners first." Partnership. The word hung in the air between them, shimmering with a possibility she had never considered. Her father had owned her prospects. The contract had transferred that ownership to this man. But Boone Calder was speaking of partnership, of choice. He was giving her back a piece of the freedom she thought she had lost forever. A woman came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on an apron. She was older, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun and a face that looked as though it had been carved from hardwood. Her expression was stern, her eyes sharp and assessing as she looked from Boone to Lydia. "Marin, this is Miss Hart," Boone said, his voice carrying the same quiet authority. "Lydia, this is Marin Doyle. She manages the house." Marin Doyle just nodded once, her gaze lingering on Lydia for a long moment before she turned and went back inside without a word. Boone finally hopped down from the wagon and came around to her side, offering a hand to help her down. His hand was rough and calloused, but his grip was gentle. As her feet touched the ground of the Calder ranch, the red dust settling around her shoes, Lydia felt a profound sense of dislocation. She was 1,000 miles from everything she had ever known, bound to a stranger, and caught in the opening moves of a conflict she did not yet comprehend. The loneliness of the vast landscape was immense, a physical presence pressing in on all sides. But as she looked at the quiet man standing before her, at the simple house that might become her home, she felt something else, too. It was not hope, not yet. It was smaller, more fragile. It was the feeling that her mother's last words might not be an impossible command after all. "Thank you, Mr. Calder," she said, her voice clear and steady, "for your kindness." He just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Boone," he said, "my name is Boone." He turned to unload her trunk, and Lydia stood in the Montana sunlight, the dry wind teasing a loose strand of her hair. She was a stranger in a strange land, a piece of property in a transaction. But for the first time, she felt the possibility that she might be able to live, not just endure, and in that quiet, sunlit valley. That small possibility felt as wide and immense as the sky above. The days at the Calder Ranch fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun. It was a rhythm Lydia's body had to learn from scratch. Her mornings no longer began with the distant chime of a clock in a quiet Boston hall, but with the first pale light spilling over the eastern hills and the sound of men's voices and the clatter of pans from Marin Doyle's kitchen. Marin was a woman of few words and endless, practical motion. She did not welcome Lydia so much as absorb her into the ranch's ecosystem, assigning her tasks with a curt nod or a pointed gesture. Lydia learned to haul water from the well, her soft hands quickly growing calloused and red. She learned to knead bread dough until her shoulders ached, to pluck a chicken with a grim efficiency that would have horrified her former self, and to mend a tear in a canvas shirt with stitches that were, Marin conceded with a grunt, surprisingly neat. The lessons were constant and unsentimental. One afternoon, Marin caught Lydia about to toss out a basin of soapy wash water. The older woman's hand shot out and stopped her. Not a word was spoken. Marin simply picked up the basin, carried it out the back door to a small, struggling vegetable patch, and poured the gray water carefully around the base of the squash plants. She looked at Lydia, her expression clear. In this land, nothing was wasted, especially not water. "We save water in the dry season," she said, her first unsolicited piece of advice, "and the dry season is always coming." Lydia found a strange satisfaction in the exhaustion that settled in her bones each night. It was a clean, honest fatigue, a world away from the soul-deep weariness of her life in Boston. Here, her efforts produced tangible results, a stack of freshly laundered linens, a warm loaf of bread on the cooling rack, a horse's coat gleaming after a thorough grooming. She learned the names of the men. Hector Ruiz was the foreman, a quiet, watchful man with a face like tanned leather who had served in the cavalry and still moved with a soldier's economy. Eamon Shea was a boy of 17 with a quick smile and even quicker eyes, who seemed to be everywhere at once, mending fences or rounding up strays. They treated her with a shy, respectful distance, calling her Miss Hart. Boone was a steady presence, always working alongside his men. He was the first one in the barn in the morning and the last one to leave at night. He spoke to her politely at meals, asking if she was settling in, but their conversations were brief, functional, yet she found herself watching him. She watched the way he gentled a spooked horse with a low voice and a steady hand. She watched the way he listened, truly listened. When Hector pointed out a problem with a section of fence, there was a deep-seated stillness about him, a competence that needed no announcement. One clear, cool afternoon, after they had finished the midday meal, he approached her on the porch where she was reading a book she had brought from home. "Would you like to ride out for a bit?" he asked. "There is something I think you should see." She was a clumsy rider, unused to the western saddle, but she agreed. He saddled a gentle mare for her, checking the cinches himself, his movements patient and sure. They rode out of the valley, climbing a long, grassy slope toward a high bluff dotted with ancient, twisted pine trees. The higher they climbed, the more the world seemed to expand. The wind grew stronger, carrying the scent of dust and wild sage. When they reached the top, he dismounted and helped her down. Below them, the entire Ash Creek Valley was laid out like a map. She could see his ranch house and barns, small as toys. She could trace the shimmering ribbon of the Willow River as it snaked through the valley floor, the source of life for the green pastures and the darker green stands of cottonwood that lined its banks. In the distance, she could see the smaller homesteads of the other ranchers, the Brennans, the Ortegas, the Sullivans, each with their own patch of cultivated green in the vast, arid landscape. "It is beautiful," she said, the words feeling inadequate. Boone stood beside her, his gaze sweeping across the land with an expression she could not quite read. It was more than pride. It was a kind of reverence. "My father," he said, his voice quiet against the wind. He believed a man's worth was measured by how much he could take from the land, how much he could clear, how much he could own. He worked himself into an early grave trying to make this place bigger. He picked up a flat, smooth stone, turning it over in his palm. "I do not see it that way. I believe our job is to be good stewards, to care for it, to leave it healthier than we found it. This valley was here long before any Calder set foot in it. It will be here long after we are gone. We are just borrowing it for a time." He was not just talking about land. He was talking about a philosophy, a way of being in the world that was the complete opposite of her father's desperate, grasping ambition. It was the opposite of the cold transaction that had brought her here. She looked at his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the seriousness in his eyes, and a fragile seed of trust began to sprout in the barren soil of her skepticism. Their peaceful survey was shattered 2 days later. Lydia was in the small garden, pulling weeds under Marin's watchful eye, when she saw a buggy approaching. It was far more elegant than any wagon she had seen in Ash Creek, lacquered black and pulled by a matched pair of fine gray horses. A man handled the reins, a man dressed in a tailored suit and a crisp hat. Beside him sat one of the men she had seen at the train station, the lean one with the watchful eyes. Boone and Hector came out from the barn, wiping their hands on their trousers. They stood waiting as the buggy pulled to a stop. The man in the suit stepped down with a flourish. He was about 45, with a handsome, florid face and an air of complete self-assurance. This had to be Silas Reddick. "Boone," he said, his voice smooth and expansive. "I was in the neighborhood. Thought I would stop by and see how you are settling in with your new acquisition." His eyes flickered toward the house, and Lydia felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She was the acquisition. Boone did not rise to the bait. "What do you want, Silas?" Reddick smiled, a thin, predatory expression. "The same thing I have always wanted, to be a good neighbor. I am here to repeat my generous offer for your water rights to the Willow. In fact, seeing as you have new responsibilities, I am prepared to increase my offer by 10%. Think of it. Boone, you could buy a much larger spread up north. No more squabbling with your neighbors over a trickle of water come August." Boone's face was like stone. "The water belongs to the valley. Silas, it is not for sale. Reddick's smile tightened. A shame. A man ought to be forward-thinking, especially a family man. He looked directly at the house again, his meaning as clear as a gunshot. A man with a wife, a home. He has so much more to protect, and so much more to lose. The threat hung in the dry air, unspoken but absolute. He tipped his hat, climbed back into his buggy, and drove away, leaving a cloud of red dust and a profound sense of menace in his wake. That night, Lydia lay in her bed, the room Boone had promised her, with its sturdy lock on the door. She listened to the sounds of the ranch settling down for the night. The low nicker of a horse, the distant cry of a coyote. The beauty of the landscape that had begun to soothe her now seemed to hold a hidden threat. The hawks circling in the vast sky looked like vultures. The cold, brilliant stars in the blackness overhead felt distant and uncaring. Reddick's words echoed in her mind. She was the reason for his visit, the new vulnerability in Boone's life. She was a liability. The kindness Boone had shown her, the promise he had made, suddenly seemed suspect. Was it genuine, or was it merely the careful handling of a valuable piece of property? A clever strategy to ensure her compliance in this fight she had been unwittingly drawn into. Her old life had been a cage of polite expectations. She feared this new one was simply a larger, more dangerous cage, and she did not yet know the nature of its bars. Who was this man? Boone called her. Was he her protector or just another owner? The question circled her, relentless as the prairie wind. A week later, the question was still unanswered. The early autumn chill was setting in, and Boone was meeting with Hector and a few other ranchers in the main room of the house. Lydia was meant to be serving them coffee, but she found herself lingering by the fireplace, listening. They were discussing the need for more winter pasture. "We will have to clear the north slope," Hector was saying, pointing to a hand-drawn map on the table. "It is the only way to support the herd if we get a hard winter. But that will mean diverting another ditch from the creek." One of the other men, Brennan, argued. "Reddick will claim we are taking more than our share. He is just looking for an excuse." They went back and forth, the problem a knot they could not untangle. Lydia looked at the map, then thought of the things Marin had taught her, the lessons of conservation born from scarcity. She thought of the leaky irrigation ditches she had seen, water seeping into the dry soil long before it reached the fields. An idea, startling in its clarity, took hold. Her heart began to beat faster. She, who had been taught to be silent and decorative, was about to speak. "Excuse me," she said, her voice small but clear in the sudden silence. All the men turned to look at her, their expressions ranging from surprise to mild annoyance. She stepped forward, her hands clasped to stop them from shaking. "You are talking about expanding the pasture. But what if you improved the pasture you already have?" Hector frowned. "What do you mean, miss?" "The irrigation ditches," she said, gaining confidence. "They leak. You lose almost half the water to seepage before it reaches the lower fields. What if, instead of digging a new ditch, you used the men's time to improve the ones you have if you widened them, and lined the important sections with clay from the creek bed? You could double the amount of water that reaches the grass. The grazing would be richer. You might be able to support the same number of cattle on less land, without touching the north slope or giving Reddick an excuse to start a fight." The room was utterly still. The men stared at her. Brennan looked skeptical. Hector looked thoughtful. But Boone was looking at her as if he had never truly seen her before. He walked to the table and stared down at the map, his finger tracing the lines of the ditches she had described. He was silent for a long, tense minute. Then he looked up, not at the other men, but directly at Lydia. His eyes were clear, and in them she saw not surprise, but a dawning respect. "By God," he said softly, "she is right. Hector, tomorrow morning, I want you to take Eamon and pull a team to the creek bed. We will start hauling clay." It was a simple decision, a practical solution to a practical problem. But for Lydia, it was a seismic shift. In that moment, she was not an acquisition. She was not a liability or a piece of property. She was a partner. Her voice, for the first time in her life, had been heard, and it had been valued. Later that evening, as she stood on the porch, pulling her shawl tighter against the cold, she looked out at the vast, dark expanse of the valley. The stars seemed impossibly bright, and from a distant ridge, she heard the long, lonely howl of a wolf. The sound was still wild, still dangerous, but for the first time, it did not sound only like a threat. It sounded like a part of her new, uncertain and unexpectedly vital world, a world where she might just have a place. The peace of the valley was a fragile thing. As Lydia was beginning to learn, it could be shattered in the time it took for the sun to rise. The morning began like any other, with a pale gray light filtering into the kitchen and the smell of coffee and bacon. It was Eamon who brought the first crack in the day's placid surface. He burst into the kitchen, his young face pale and his breath coming in ragged bursts. "The fence," he gasped, looking at Boone, "the fence on the west pasture. It is cut, and a dozen head are gone." Boone was on his feet in an instant, his coffee forgotten. A quiet, dangerous stillness settled over him. Hector Ruiz, already halfway through his breakfast, pushed his plate away and stood, his hand resting near the holstered pistol on his hip. "Saddle the horses," Boone said, his voice level and cold. Lydia watched from the doorway, a dish towel clutched in her hands, her heart a cold stone in her chest. This was not random. This was a message. They rode out, Boone and Hector, two grim figures against the brightening sky. Lydia was left with Marin in a house that suddenly felt too large and too quiet. For 2 hours. She tried to busy herself with chores, but her mind was in the west pasture. Every gust of wind sounded like a gunshot. When the men returned, they were not alone. They were leading their horses, and slung across Hector's saddle was his own bloodied shirt. Boone's face was a mask of controlled fury. "What happened?" Marin asked, her voice sharp as she moved toward Hector. "They did not take the cattle," Boone said, his words clipped. "They drove them into a ravine, shot 3 of them, left them for the buzzards." Marin led a grimacing Hector to a chair in the kitchen. He had a long, raw gash along his upper arm where a bullet had torn through his sleeve and flesh. It was shallow, but it had bled profusely. As Marin cleaned the wound with carbolic soap and water, Hector told the rest of the story. "We saw them," he said through gritted teeth. "2 riders on the ridge. Too far to see their faces, but they knew we were there. They fired a shot, just to let us know they could. I gave chase. It was foolish. They were waiting. The shot was just a warning." "There is no proof," Boone said, his voice flat with frustration. "It is their word against ours, and Sheriff Miller is in Reddick's pocket. It would be a waste of breath to even file a report." Lydia felt a surge of cold anger that burned away her fear. This was how men like Reddick operated, with plausible deniability, with the quiet complicity of the law. They created a world where the truth was useless if you could not prove it. While Marin bandaged Hector's arm, Lydia went to her room. She returned not with condolences, but with a ledger book and a bottle of ink. She sat at the main table, pushed aside the salt cellar, and dipped her pen. "What are you doing?" Boone asked, his brow furrowed. "I am making a record," she said, her voice steady. She drew a line down the center of the page. On the left, she wrote the date and the time. On the right, she began to write. "Cut fence in west pasture. Approximately 12 cattle driven off. 3 head, 2 heifers and a young bull. Found shot. Hector Ruiz sustained a bullet wound to the left arm while pursuing 2 unidentified riders." Her handwriting was precise, the letters elegant and clear. It was a skill learned in a Boston finishing school, a world away from this raw violence, but she wielded it now like a weapon, an act of defiance. If the sheriff would not keep a record, she would. "This is good," Boone said, looking over her shoulder, "but it is not enough." A few days later, Lydia rode into Ash Creek with Boone. While he conducted business at the general store, she sought out the town schoolhouse. It was a small, neat building, and through the window she could see a woman of about 60 with intelligent eyes and hair the color of spun silver, patiently guiding a young boy through his letters. This was Eleanor Pike. When the school day ended, Lydia introduced herself. She explained the situation at the ranch, the constant low-level harassment that had now escalated to bloodshed. "The sheriff is a creature of Silas Reddick," Eleanor said, her lips thinning. "He will do nothing." "I know," Lydia replied. "That is why I have written a letter to the territorial delegate. I have detailed everything that has happened, but I am not a lawyer. I do not know the proper language to make them listen." Eleanor Pike read the letter Lydia had drafted. She nodded slowly. "Your account is clear, my dear, but we can make it stronger." She took Lydia's draft and, with a few deft strokes of her pen, inserted phrases like infringement of riparian rights, deliberate destruction of property, and conspiracy to intimidate. She transformed Lydia's plain-spoken account into a document with the undeniable weight of legal formality. "Thank you," Lydia said, feeling a surge of gratitude for this unexpected ally. "Justice is a slow-moving mule," Eleanor told her, her eyes kind but realistic. "But sometimes, you just have to keep prodding it to make it take a step." That night, in the big barn at the Calder Ranch, the air thick with the smell of hay and horses, a different kind of prodding took place. Boone had called a meeting. The Ortegas were there, and the Brennans, the Sullivans, and 3 other families who ran small spreads in the valley. Lantern light cast long, dancing shadows on their worried faces. Boone laid out the situation plainly, ending with the attack on Hector. "Reddick wants to bleed us out, one by one," he said. "He wants us to get scared, get tired, and sell him our water rights for pennies on the dollar. Alone. We might just break." "So we fight," said Mr. Ortega, a fiery man with a thick mustache. "Fight with what?" asked Brennan, a nervous man who was constantly wiping his sweaty palms on his trousers. "Reddick has a dozen men on his payroll. He owns the sheriff. If we fight, he will have the law on his side, and we will be ruined." Fear, thick and cloying, settled in the barn. It was then that Lydia stepped forward, holding her ledger. "We do not have to fight his way," she said, her voice carrying in the quiet space. "We can fight our way." She held up the book. "I have started a record for the Calder Ranch. What if we all did? What if we created a log of every strange rider, every spooked herd, every cut fence? What if we shared the information? What if, when one of us is in trouble, we all ride to help? We could form an alliance, the Ash Creek Valley Alliance. We could pool our resources for defense. We could create a record so detailed and so corroborated by all of us that not even a paid-off sheriff could ignore it forever." She had their attention. Boone stepped to her side, a silent show of support. "She is right," he said. "We create our own law, our own order. Right here in this valley, we agree to stand together. We put it on paper." A fierce debate followed. Brennan was terrified, arguing that such an alliance would be seen as a direct provocation. But Ortega was swayed, and the quiet, thoughtful Sullivan eventually nodded his agreement. In the end, a simple document was drawn up on a piece of foolscap. It was a promise to share information, to offer mutual aid, and to contribute to a shared legal fund. 6 families, including the Calders, signed their names by the flickering lantern light. Brennan and 2 others abstained, their fear stronger than their hope. But it was a start. It was a flicker of defiance in the face of Reddick's suffocating power. The response came less than a week later. It came not with a gunshot, but with the smell of smoke on the night wind. Lydia was woken by a frantic pounding on the house door. It was Eamon again, his face smudged with soot, his eyes wide with terror. "Fire!" he yelled. "The south pasture! It is all on fire!" From the porch, they could see it. A hellish orange glow lit up the southern horizon, and a towering column of black smoke billowed into the starry sky. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze, was now gusting, fanning the flames, driving the fire straight toward the Sullivan homestead and Boone's own winter grazing land. There was no time for discussion. Boone was already shouting orders, his voice cutting through the panic. "Hector, get the men. Eamon, ride to the Ortegas. I will get the Brennans and the others. We meet at the creek line. Lydia, Marin, get every bucket, every barrel. Fill them with water, load them on the buckboard, and bring burlap sacks. As many as you can find. Soak them." Chaos erupted, but it was an organized chaos. Men shouted, horses whinnied, and the ranch exploded into frantic but purposeful activity. Lydia worked alongside Marin, her movements swift and sure. The timid Boston woman was gone, replaced by someone who knew what needed to be done. By the time they reached the fire line, it was a terrifying spectacle. A wall of flame, 20 feet high in places, roared across the dry grass, consuming everything in its path with a deafening hunger. The heat was a physical blow, and the air was thick with choking ash. But they were not alone. The Ortegas were already there, their sons beating at the edges of the fire with wet sacks. Soon, the Sullivans arrived, and then, to Lydia's surprise, the Brennans appeared over the ridge, their faces grim with determination. The families who had signed the pact, and even those who had not, were coming. The threat was not to one of them, but to all of them. For hours they fought the beast. Men dug fire breaks with shovels, their faces black with soot, their lungs heaving. Women and children formed bucket brigades from the creek, their small efforts a desperate prayer against the inferno. Lydia found her place directing the flow of water, organizing a makeshift aid station for the burned and exhausted, handing out cups of precious water and words of encouragement. At one point, Boone stumbled back from the front line, his face a mask of soot, his eyebrows singed. He leaned against the wagon, gasping for air. "It is moving too fast," he said, his voice raw. Lydia handed him a cup of water. His hand brushed hers, and for a second, their eyes met across the chaos. "Not exactly a Boston literary salon, is it?" he managed, a grim attempt at a smile. "No," she replied, her own voice surprisingly steady. "The conversation is certainly less refined." He let out a short, rough bark of a laugh. The sound was miraculous in the midst of the roaring flames. It was a small, shared moment of humanity, a spark of connection in the heart of the destruction. They fought until dawn. As the sun rose, casting a sickly yellow light through the smoke, the wind finally died down. The fire, robbed of its fuel and its ally, began to falter, exhausted, scorched, and bleeding from a dozen minor cuts and burns. The people of Ash Creek Valley finally brought it under control. Lydia stood beside Boone, looking out at the devastation. 40, maybe 50 acres of prime grazing land were gone, turned to a blackened, smoking wasteland. The air smelled of ash and loss. But as she looked at the faces around her, at Ortega sharing his water with Brennan, at Mrs. Sullivan bandaging Eamon's burned hand, she saw something else. They were no longer just a collection of individuals. They were a community, forged in the heat of that fire. The flames had taken their grass, but they had burned away their isolation. They had lost the pasture, but they had found each other. And in the grim, smoky light of that new day, Lydia knew that Silas Reddick had made a terrible mistake. He had meant to break them. Instead, he had made them strong. The aftermath of the fire was a landscape of black and gray. For days, the valley lived under a haze of smoke, the sun a tarnished coin in the sky, but the fire that had meant to divide them had instead fused them together. Men who had once been solitary neighbors now worked side by side, rebuilding the Sullivans' burned fences, pooling their remaining winter feed, and sharing the back-breaking labor of clearing the blackened earth. The Ash Creek Valley Alliance was no longer a signature on a piece of paper. It was calloused hands, shared meals, and a common, weary resolve in their eyes. Silas Reddick came 3 days after the last embers had been extinguished. He did not come alone. He rode at the head of a dozen men, a small army of hired guns whose faces were hard and impassive. They reined in their horses on the low rise overlooking the Calder Ranch, a deliberate and menacing formation against the skyline. Work in the valley stuttered to a halt as Boone, Hector, and the Ortega brothers, who had been helping clear debris, walked out to meet them. Lydia watched from the porch, her hands tightly gripping the railing. Marin stood just inside the doorway, a heavy iron skillet tellingly close at hand. Reddick dismounted, his polished boots sinking into the dusty yard. He surveyed the scene, his gaze taking in the exhausted men and the distant black scar on the land, and he smiled a smile devoid of all warmth. "A terrible tragedy, Boone," he said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "A man could lose everything in a fire. It makes you think about what is truly important. Security, a future for your family." "Get to your point, Silas," Boone said, his voice dangerously quiet. "My point is that I am a reasonable man," Reddick continued, spreading his hands in a gesture of magnanimity. "I am prepared to make a final offer. Not just to you, to everyone in this valley. I will buy your deeds, every last one of them. A fair price, more than this scorched earth is worth. I will give you enough to start over somewhere else, somewhere with fewer hardships." He let the word hang there, a clear reference to the hardships he himself had caused. It was not an offer, it was an ultimatum. Surrender or face annihilation. Mr. Ortega spat on the ground. "This land is not for sale." Reddick's eyes hardened. "Everything is for sale, my friend. It is just a matter of the price. You can take my money now, or you can take nothing when I foreclose on your loans next spring, and I will own this valley either way." Boone took a step forward. "You will not have this valley, not 1 acre of it. Now get off my land." Reddick laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Your land." He gestured to Lydia on the porch. "You bring this woman here, this piece of Boston finery, and you think that makes you a patriarch. It just makes you a bigger fool. You have given yourself a weakness, a tender spot." It was then that Lydia moved. She walked down the steps and across the yard until she stood just behind Boone's shoulder. She met Reddick's condescending gaze without flinching. "You are mistaken, Mr. Reddick," she said, her voice clear and carrying, cutting through the masculine tension. "You see me as a weakness. That is because you see everything, and everyone, as something to be owned or broken. You do not understand what a partner is." Reddick's amusement faded, replaced by a flicker of surprise. "You think your money gives you power," she continued, her words precise and cold. "But your power requires our fear. It requires our silence. And I am afraid we are fresh out of both. We have a record of your actions, Mr. Reddick, a detailed record. And a copy has been sent to the territorial delegate. Your name is known beyond this valley now. Every move you make from this day forward will be scrutinized. You are the one who should be concerned about your tender spots. A man with so many questionable business dealings must have a great deal to lose." A stunned silence fell over the yard. Reddick stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief that was slowly hardening into pure rage. He had come expecting to deal with stubborn, uneducated ranchers. He had not expected this. He had not expected her. He turned his fury on Boone. "You will regret this, both of you." He spun on his heel, swung himself up into his saddle, and led his riders away without another word. They sat on the porch that night, Boone and Lydia, long after Marin and the others had gone to bed. The moon was a thin sliver, offering little light. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken things. "He should not have spoken to you that way," Boone said finally, his voice rough. "I am sorry I brought you into this danger." Lydia turned to look at him, at his strong profile silhouetted against the dark. "You did not bring me into it, Boone. My father's debts brought me here, but I am the one who walked down those steps today. That was my choice." She paused. "I am choosing to stand here, with you." He looked at her then, and in the faint starlight, she saw the worry etched on his face. But she also saw something else, something deeper and more vulnerable. He was afraid, not for himself, but for her. The realization was a sudden, sharp ache in her chest. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek. Her name was a whisper on his lips. "Lydia." She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. The air grew thick, charged with a current that had been building between them for weeks. He leaned closer, and she could feel the warmth of his breath, her own breath caught in her throat. It was a moment suspended in time, a precipice of feeling she had never known. He was going to kiss her. She wanted him to. But then he pulled back. His hand dropped from her face and he looked away, out at the dark hills. "Not yet," he said, His voice strained. Not until this is over. Not until you are safe. She understood. A kiss now would be a promise made in the shadow of a threat. He wanted to offer her a future, not just a shared moment of desperation. It was a gesture of respect so profound it touched her more deeply than any kiss could have. 2 nights later, the leaders of the Alliance met in Boone's barn. The mood was grim. Reddick's threat had been a declaration of war. "He will try to ruin us financially first," Sullivan said. "Then he will bring the violence." "We cannot wait for him to make the next move," Hector said, his hand resting on his pistol. "We have to hit him." "No," Lydia said, stepping into the circle of lantern light. "We cannot use his methods. Violence will only bring the law down on us. And the law is his. We have to be smarter. We have to hit him where it hurts him most. His wallet. And his reputation." "What do you mean?" Ortega asked. "The big cattle shipment," she said. "I heard the men talking in town. Reddick has a government contract to supply beef to the agency at Fort Shaw. His entire herd is being held in the North Basin, ready to be driven to the railhead on Friday. That contract is his pride. Missing it would be a humiliation and a significant financial loss." "So we steal his cattle," Eamon said, his eyes bright with excitement. "Not steal," Hector corrected, a slow smile spreading across his face as he understood. "Disperse, scatter." Mr. Ortega, whose family had ranched in these hills for 2 generations, long before men like Reddick arrived, nodded in agreement. "I know that basin. There are 3 box canyons leading out of it, and an old game trail on the west ridge that only a goat or a fool would use. Reddick's men will guard the main exit. They will not expect trouble from anywhere else." The plan was audacious, dangerous, and required perfect execution. It was a strike made not with guns, but with horsemanship, terrain, and a deep, shared knowledge of the land. The night they chose was as black as the inside of a pocket. There was no moon, and a thick blanket of clouds obscured the stars. The wind howled down from the mountains, a mournful, wild sound that covered the noise of their approach. 8 of them rode out: Boone, Hector, the Ortega brothers, Sullivan's eldest son, and 3 others. They were ghosts in the darkness, their faces grim, their movements economical. Lydia stood on the porch, watching them disappear into the oppressive dark. Every gust of wind seemed to carry a premonition, a whisper of danger. This was a different kind of fight, but it was a fight nonetheless. The men moved with the quiet confidence of wolves. Hector and Ortega led them along paths that were invisible in the dark, their senses tuned to the land. They tethered their horses in a deep ravine and crept the last half-mile on foot. Below them, in the vast, dark basin, they could see the faint orange dots of the night guards' campfires, and they could hear the massive herd, thousands of head of cattle, a restless, breathing entity in the darkness. They worked in teams. Ortega and his brother moved like shadows to the south, pulling down the makeshift fence that blocked a narrow canyon. Hector took 2 men to the west, to the treacherous game trail. Boone and the others approached the main herd from the north, downwind. There was no signal. There was only the wind and the darkness. Boone gave a low whistle, a sound like a night bird. The men beside him shook out their slickers, the oiled canvas crackling in the wind. They began to move forward, slowly at first, then faster, whistling and shouting, flapping the slickers. The effect was instantaneous. The nearest cattle, already unnerved by the howling wind, started and scrambled away. The panic was a spark that ignited a chain reaction. A low rumble of hooves began, a sound that Lydia, miles away, could feel in the floorboards of the house. The rumble grew to a deep, terrifying thunder. The entire herd, a living, breathing wave of blackness, surged away from the noise. They did not surge toward the guarded main exit. They poured into the newly opened paths, a torrent of panicked beef flowing into the box canyons and scattering up the game trail. The night guards were taken completely by surprise, their shouts lost in the deafening roar of the stampede. The men of the Alliance did not stay to watch. Their work was done. They slipped back to their horses and rode home, leaving chaos and a ruined contract in their wake. They had not fired a shot. They had not harmed a man or a beast, but they had struck a devastating blow, using the land itself as their weapon. The wind howled behind them, carrying the sounds of Reddick's empire beginning to crumble. The humiliation of the stampede left a festering silence over the valley. Everyone knew that Silas Reddick was not a man to suffer a loss of face, let alone a fortune, without retribution. The victory felt hollow, a temporary reprieve before a much larger storm. They did not have to wait long. The news came with Eamon Shea, who rode his lathered horse into the Calder yard just after dusk, his face streaked with dust and fear. He had been in town, picking up supplies, and had seen the new men riding in. "There must be 30 of them," he told the grim-faced group assembled on Boone's porch. "Maybe more. Hard men. Not ranchers. They are carrying rifles, not branding irons. Reddick has hired an army." The air grew cold. 30 hired guns was not a force for intimidation. It was a force for annihilation. It was enough to wipe every last homesteader out of the valley and burn their homes to the ground. That night, Boone sent riders to every member of the alliance. The message was simple. Reddick is coming. We make our stand together, or we fall apart. The responses were a measure of the men who sent them. The Ortegas and Sullivans pledged to be there by morning. But a rider returned from the Brennan homestead with a faltering message. Brennan was afraid. He had a wife and young children. He could not risk a gunfight against those odds. 2 other families sent similar regrets. The alliance, which had felt so strong in the face of a fire, was beginning to fracture in the face of cold steel. There was no sleep at the Calder Ranch that night. Under the cold, watchful eyes of the stars, they prepared for a siege. Hector Ruiz, his cavalry experience suddenly invaluable, directed the men. They used wagons and felled logs to create barricades around the main house and barn. They filled sandbags, their shovels grating in the darkness, and placed them in the windows of the house and along the ridges of the outbuildings, creating defensible firing positions. Every rifle and shotgun was cleaned, every box of cartridges laid out and counted. The ranch was transformed from a place of life and work into a small, desperate fort. Inside the house, Marin and Lydia made their own preparations. The large kitchen table was scrubbed clean and became a makeshift surgeon's station. Marin, her face set in grim lines, laid out her supplies, clean cloths for bandages, a bottle of whiskey for antiseptic, a pot of water set to boil for sterilizing her sharpest knives. Lydia, her mind working with a cold, clear precision, took inventory of their food and water, ensuring they could hold out if it came to that. She gathered every blanket and quilt, stacking them in a corner of the main room that would be most protected from the fighting. They worked in near silence, the quiet, purposeful movements of women preparing for the terrible consequences of men's violence. Just before dawn, another group arrived. It was not more fighters. Eleanor Pike rode in on a small buggy, and behind her came a procession of about 15 people from the town of Ash Creek. The blacksmith was there, and the general store owner, and several women Lydia recognized from the church. They were not carrying guns. They were carrying lanterns, though the sun was beginning to rise, and Bibles. "What is this?" Boone asked, walking out to meet them. Eleanor's face was pale but determined. "We cannot fight," she said, "but we can watch. We are the Witness Corps. Silas Reddick operates in the shadows. He relies on people being too scared to speak up. Today, we will not be silent. We will be the eyes and ears of the law, even if the law itself is corrupt. We will stand on that western ridge, and we will make a record of everything that happens here. Let him commit his crimes in the full light of day, in front of us all." Boone looked at the small, brave group of townspeople, at their lanterns and their Bibles, and he felt a surge of something more powerful than hope. It was a profound sense of rightness. He nodded slowly. "Keep to the ridge," he said, "and stay low." The dawn came, spilling over the mountains in breathtaking waves of gold and rose. It was a morning of terrible beauty, the light gilding the valley in a peaceful glow that belied the tension in the air. And then they saw them, a long, ragged line of riders appearing on the far side of the valley, their forms dark against the brilliant sunrise. They moved slowly, deliberately, an advancing tide of menace. Reddick was at their head, a commanding figure on a big black horse. They stopped 100 yards from the barricades. The silence was absolute, broken only by the snort of a horse and the cry of a distant hawk. "Boone!" Reddick's voice boomed across the yard, a sound of pure, arrogant power. "This is your last chance. Sign over your deed and ride out of here with your woman. I will let you live." Boone stood up from behind a barricade of sandbags, his rifle held loosely in his hands. "This is our home. Silas," he called back, his own voice steady and clear. "It is not for sale." "Then it will be your grave," Reddick snarled. He raised his hand, about to give the order to attack. In that moment, with every man on the Calder ranch holding his breath, a new sound was heard. It was a shout, coming not from Reddick's men but from the western ridge. Every head turned. There, silhouetted against the rising sun, was another group of riders. It was Brennan, his face no longer fearful but set with a desperate courage. And behind him were the two other ranchers who had hesitated, and a handful of the townspeople who had decided that bearing witness was not enough. "The valley stands together," Brennan bellowed, his voice cracking with emotion. The arrival of a mere half-dozen extra guns should not have mattered against 30, but it did. It was a moral blow, a visible sign that Reddick's power to intimidate had been broken. A ripple of uncertainty went through his line of hired men. They were being paid to fight ranchers, not an entire, unified community. Reddick's face contorted in a mask of pure rage. He had been defied, humiliated, and now he was being openly challenged. He drew his pistol. "Fire!" he roared. A single shot cracked from his line, and then the air exploded. The quiet morning was torn apart by a deafening volley of gunfire. The men of the Alliance, holding to their principle, returned fire only after they had been fired upon. The exchange was short, brutal, and chaotic. Men on both sides scrambled for cover, the sharp reports of rifles echoing off the hills, Reddick's hired guns, their enthusiasm dampened by the unexpected resistance, hesitated. Their advance stalled. Reddick, seeing his victory slipping away, seemed to lose his mind. Blind with fury, he spurred his horse forward, breaking from the line of his men, charging directly toward the barricades. He raised his pistol, his eyes fixed on one target, Boone. Lydia saw it all from the window of the main room. She had a rifle in her hands, one Boone had pressed on her the night before. He had shown her how to load and aim it, his hands briefly covering hers, his expression grim. She had recoiled from the cold, heavy weight of the weapon, a tool of brutal finality so alien to her entire existence. Now, watching Reddick charge, his face a mask of hate, she saw Boone raise his own rifle, trying to get a clear shot, but he was exposed. Reddick was closer. In 2 seconds, he would be dead. A lifetime of lessons, of being a proper lady, of abhorring violence, screamed in her mind. But another voice, quieter and stronger, rose above it. It was her mother's voice. "Live to live. Do not just endure." And in that blinding flash of clarity, she knew that living, truly living, meant fighting for the things you loved. She raised the rifle to her shoulder, the wooden stock clumsy and unfamiliar against her cheek. She looked down the long barrel. Just as Boone had shown her, she saw Silas Reddick, a figure of pure destruction. She saw Boone, a figure of quiet strength and kindness, the man who had offered her a partnership instead of ownership. She did not think. She acted. She lined up the sights on the charging man's shoulder, took a steadying breath, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her, the explosion deafening in the small room. Across the yard, Silas Reddick was thrown from his saddle as if by an invisible hand. He hit the ground hard, his pistol flying from his grasp. The single, deliberate shot had an immediate effect. The firefight faltered. The hired guns saw their leader fall. Their will to fight, which had been purely financial, evaporated. They had been paid to bully, not to die for a rich man's tantrum. One by one, they lowered their weapons. The battle was over. It had lasted less than 5 minutes. Silas Reddick lay on the ground, clutching a shattered shoulder, his face a mixture of agony and disbelief. His army, disarmed and surrounded by the ranchers and the townspeople who had come down from the ridge, stood in sullen silence. And in the window of the house, Lydia Hart stood with a smoking rifle in her hands, trembling not from fear, but from the fierce, terrifying power of her own choice. She had not just endured, she had acted. She had saved him. The community had held, and in its most critical moment, she had been its unlikely, unwilling, and ultimately victorious champion. The brittle silence that followed the final gunshot was more profound than the noise it replaced. In the yard, Silas Reddick's hired army stood sullen and defeated, their weapons in a pile on the dusty ground. Reddick himself, propped against a wagon wheel and clutching his bleeding shoulder, glared at the community that had refused to break. His face was a contorted mask of pain and disbelief. Boone did not go to the prisoners first. He turned and strode toward the house, his long legs eating up the ground, his eyes fixed on the window where Lydia stood. He saw the rifle still in her hands, the wisp of smoke at its muzzle. He saw the tremor in her arms, the wide, shocked look in her eyes. He mounted the porch steps in a single bound and pushed open the door. She was standing just as he had seen her, frozen in place. The heavy rifle seemed to weigh more than she did. He gently took it from her grasp, its barrel still warm, and leaned it against the wall. He placed his hands on her shoulders. His touch was firm, grounding. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and rough with emotion. She could only nod, a single, jerky movement. The reality of what she had done was crashing down on her, a cold wave of shock. She had taken up a weapon. She had fired it at a man. The elegant, composed woman from Boston felt like a distant memory, a character from a book she had once read. "You saved my life," he said, his thumb stroking her shoulders. She looked up at him then, into his serious, grateful eyes, and saw the truth of it. It was not an act of violence, but an act of preservation, an act of partnership. The standoff in the yard was broken by the arrival of new riders. These were not hired guns or ranchers. One was a tall, lean man with a dusty coat and a U.S. Marshal's star pinned to his vest. The other was an older, distinguished gentleman with a sharp suit and the air of a man accustomed to authority. "I am Marshal Hayes," the lean man announced, his gaze taking in the scene with a practiced, weary eye. "And this is Circuit Judge Morrison. We received a letter regarding some disturbances in this valley. It appears we have arrived in a timely fashion." Sheriff Miller, who had finally ridden out from town, looking flustered and impotent, blanched at the sight of them. The arrival of federal law stripped him of all authority. The carefully constructed world of Silas Reddick, built on fear and local corruption, had just been demolished. The next 2 days were a blur of legal proceedings held, of all places, in the main room of the Calder house. The long dining table, where they had shared quiet meals, was transformed into a magistrate's bench. Judge Morrison, a man with an incisive mind and a deep respect for the letter of the law, presided with an unassailable gravity. The evidence against Reddick was overwhelming and presented with a calm, methodical force. Eleanor Pike and the other members of the witness corps gave their testimony, their voices clear and unwavering as they described the unprovoked attack. Brennan, his face a mixture of shame and resolve, recounted Reddick's threats and his own fear, his testimony a powerful symbol of the community's newfound courage. The hired guns, facing charges of armed insurrection and attempted murder, quickly turned on their employer, one after another. They admitted that Reddick had hired them, that he had ordered them to burn the pasture, and that his instructions for the final assault had been brutally simple: to drive the homesteaders out by any means necessary. But the most damning evidence was Lydia's ledger. Judge Morrison held the simple, leather-bound book in his hands as if it were a sacred text. He asked her to read from it, to recount the entries she had so carefully made. She sat before the makeshift court, her back straight, and read in a clear, steady voice. She detailed the cut fences, the slain cattle, the attack on Hector. Her words a calm, factual indictment that was more powerful than any emotional appeal. Boone sat beside her the entire time, his presence a silent, unwavering wall of support. He watched her, not with surprise, but with a deep, quiet pride that made her own heart feel steadier. When it was over, Judge Morrison closed the book. "Silas Reddick," he announced, his voice ringing with authority, "you are under arrest. You and these men will be transported to the territorial prison to await trial for arson, conspiracy, attempted murder, and a list of other charges I suspect will grow longer upon further investigation." Reddick, his arm in a sling, his face pale with pain and fury, was led away in chains. As he passed Lydia, his eyes burned with a venomous hatred. But she met his gaze without fear. He was just a man, a broken and defeated man whose power had evaporated under the bright, clear light of the truth. That evening, a profound exhaustion settled over the ranch, deeper than any physical fatigue. The legal battle was won. Justice had prevailed, but the cost had been etched into all of their faces. As Lydia helped Marin clean the last of the coffee cups, she felt a tremor in her hands she could not control. "You did good, child," Marin said, her voice softer than Lydia had ever heard it. "You did what you had to do. Now go rest." Lydia walked into the main room. Drawn to the warmth of the fire Boone had built in the big stone hearth, the flames danced and crackled, a comforting, domestic sound after the violence of the past weeks. Outside, the world had gone silent and white. The first snow of the season had begun to fall, thick, heavy flakes that clung to the window panes and blanketed the scarred, wounded land. It was a soft, cleansing fall, muffling all sound, erasing the tracks of the battle, promising a new start. She sank into the large armchair nearest the fire, pulling a rough woolen blanket over her shoulders, but a deep chill remained, a coldness that came from the soul. She was so very tired. Her eyes fell upon one of Boone's work shirts, hanging from a peg near the door where he had left it to dry. It was simple, homespun cotton, faded from the sun and smelling faintly of pine, leather, and him. On impulse, she stood and took the shirt from the peg. She slipped it on over her chemise. It was ridiculously large on her, the sleeves covering her hands, the hem falling to her knees, but it felt like an embrace. It was warm, real, and safe. She curled back into the chair, wrapped the blanket around her again, and with the scent of him surrounding her, she finally fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Boone found her there in the pale blue light of dawn. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers, the snow had stopped, and the world outside was a pristine expanse of white. He had entered the room quietly, intending to rekindle the fire before the others woke, and had stopped dead at the sight of her. She was curled in the chair, her head nestled in the crook of her arm, her breathing soft and even, and she was wearing his shirt. The sight sent a powerful, protective ache through his chest. She looked so small, so vulnerable, and yet he knew the incredible strength that resided within her. He walked to the corner and picked up the heavy quilt she had stacked there during their preparations. With infinite care, he draped it over her, tucking it gently around her shoulders. He stood for a moment, just watching her sleep. The morning was still and cold, a quiet sort of mischief, mixed with a deep, overwhelming affection, welled up in him. He leaned down, his voice a low murmur, more for himself than for her. "Guess that means you're mine now." The words, soft as they were, stirred her. Her eyelids fluttered open. She was not startled. She looked up and saw him there, his face close to hers, his eyes full of a gentle, teasing warmth she had never seen in them before. She registered his words, not as a claim, but as a question asked in the gruff, roundabout way of a man who did not know the language of the heart. And in that quiet, snowy dawn, she finally knew her own answer, with a certainty that was as clear and bright as the morning light on the snow. She pushed herself up slightly, the heavy quilt pooling in her lap. She reached up and touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the rough, sun-weathered line of his jaw. "It is not because of the shirt," she said, her voice soft but sure. "It is because I choose you." The teasing light in his eyes faded, replaced by something deeper, something raw and vulnerable. He leaned in, and she met him halfway. His kiss was not demanding or passionate. It was a confirmation. It was gentle, respectful, and full of unspoken promises. It was the taste of wood smoke and coffee and a future she had never dared to imagine. It was the feeling of coming home. In the quiet of the snowbound house, with the world washed clean and new outside, Lydia Hart made her second great promise, not with a contract or a letter, but with a choice that came entirely from her own free and courageous heart. The machinery of true justice, once set in motion, moved with a surprising and relentless speed. The territorial court, embodied by the unwavering Judge Morrison, did not require a grand courthouse for its work. The trial of Silas Reddick and his hired men was conducted in the Ash Creek schoolhouse, the simple room packed with the very community he had sought to terrorize. The benches, usually filled with children learning their sums, were now occupied by grim-faced ranchers and watchful townspeople, their presence a silent, powerful testimony. The verdict was never in doubt, faced with a mountain of evidence, from the sworn statements of his own men to the detailed, irrefutable timeline laid out in Lydia's ledger. Reddick's blustering defense crumbled into dust. He was found guilty on all major counts: arson, incitement to riot, conspiracy to commit murder, and a host of lesser financial crimes that the judge unearthed with surgical precision. His entire estate, from his vast ranch to his controlling shares in the town bank, was seized by the territorial authority pending liquidation and restitution. But the most significant judgment was not about prison sentences or financial penalties. It was about water. In a landmark ruling for the territory, Judge Morrison declared the water rights of the Willow River to be an asset of the entire valley. He decreed that a cooperative, formed by the local landowners and overseen by the marshal's office for its first year, would manage the fair and equitable distribution of the water, the lifeblood of the valley, which Reddick had sought to turn into a weapon of strangulation, was now its shared, protected birthright. In the days that followed, a new kind of work began, a work of building rather than defending. The Calder Ranch House became the unofficial headquarters of this new future. Lydia, with her clear mind and organized nature, found herself at the center of it. The ledger she had kept out of a desperate need for order became the model. At the long dining table, surrounded by Boone, the Ortegas, the Sullivans, and even a humbled and grateful Brennan, she helped them draft the bylaws for the new Ash Creek Cooperative. She standardized the incident logs, creating a system where every rancher would contribute to a shared record, a collective memory that would prevent any one man from ever being isolated again. She helped draft the rules for water usage, her logic and fairness cutting through old arguments and potential disputes. Boone watched her, his quiet pride a tangible presence in the room. He saw not just the woman he loved, but a leader, a strategist, a person who could see not just the problem in front of her, but the shape of the solution that lay beyond. During one of these meetings, Eleanor Pike came to the ranch. She stood by the door, listening for a long while as Lydia patiently explained a point of order to the ranchers. When they took a break, Eleanor approached her. "My dear," she said, her eyes alight with a deep respect, "I have been thinking. The children of this valley need more than just their letters and numbers. They need to learn about how the world works, about logic and law and the power of a well-reasoned argument." Lydia smiled. "I quite agree, Eleanor." "The school board has authorized me to hire an assistant," Eleanor continued, her gaze direct. 3 days a week. The pay is not a fortune, but it is a start. The position is yours, if you want it." Lydia was speechless. A job, a purpose that was entirely her own, born of her own skills. It was a form of independence she had never imagined for herself. It was a place in this community, not as Boone's wife, but as herself. Lydia Hart, teacher. "I would be honored," she said, her voice thick with emotion. The wedding was her choice, and she chose a Sunday in late November. The snow lay thick and pure upon the ground, and the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The air was so cold it seemed to sparkle. They were not married in the church, but in the yard of the Calder Ranch, the very place where they had prepared for a battle and now stood to make a promise of peace. The entire valley was there, Every family from the Alliance, and all the townspeople who had stood as witnesses on the ridge, came bundled in their warmest coats and blankets. They stood in a wide, smiling circle, their breath misting in the frigid air. Marin Doyle, for the first time Lydia had ever seen, wore a dress instead of an apron, and there was a suspicious moisture in her sharp eyes. Hector Ruiz stood beside Boone, his posture as straight and proud as if he were on a parade ground. Eamon Shea beamed from the front row, his face scrubbed clean for the occasion. Lydia wore a simple dress of deep blue wool that Marin had helped her make, and in her hair she had tucked a sprig of pine, its needles a vibrant green against the white snow. She walked to Boone's side not on the arm of a father who had sold her, but on her own, her steps sure and steady on the packed snow. Judge Morrison, who had stayed on to ensure the cooperative was properly established, performed the ceremony. His voice, which had boomed with the authority of the law, was now gentle and kind. He spoke of community, of resilience, of the bonds forged in hardship. Then it was time for their vows. Boone turned to her, taking both of her cold hands in his large, warm ones. His eyes, serious and true, met hers. "Lydia," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that was for her alone, though the whole valley listened. "The first time I saw you, I made you a promise. I said I would be kind, today. I want to make another one." He paused, his grip tightening gently on her hands. "I will be kind, every day, for all of our days." Tears welled in Lydia's eyes, but they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. This man, with his simple, profound heart, had understood everything. He was not offering her a lifetime of passion or poetry, but something far more precious. He was offering her a lifetime of respect. She smiled through her tears. "Boone," she said, her own voice clear and strong despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm it. "When I came here, I thought my life was about enduring. You have taught me that life is about choosing. So this is my promise to you. I choose you, and I will choose you again, every morning, every day, for the rest of my life." A cheer went up from the assembled crowd, a joyous, heartfelt sound that echoed across the quiet, snowy valley. Boone leaned down and kissed her, a real kiss this time, full of love and laughter and the promise of a shared future. It was a kiss that sealed not a contract, but a partnership, a covenant made freely, in the full, bright light of the Montana sun. That afternoon, after a celebratory meal in the barn that lasted for hours, the mail rider made his weekly delivery, his horse plodding through the deep snow. There was a letter for her, the envelope addressed in a familiar, elegant script that made her heart ache with a bittersweet pang of memory. It was from her mother. She took it to the main room, to the chair by the fire where she had woken up in his shirt, and broke the seal. The letter was short, but every word was a revelation. Her mother wrote of the emptiness of the Boston house, of the meaningless society calls, of the slow, creeping realization that she had been enduring for far too long. The final paragraph made Lydia's breath catch in her throat. "Your father has his business, my dearest Lydia, and I have come to realize that I must have a life. Your letters, filled with descriptions of this new world, have opened a window for me. You speak of community, of purpose, of a sky so large it makes all other troubles seem small. You have been so brave. Now, it is my turn to be brave. I have sold the last of my mother's jewelry. It is enough. I have bought a train ticket. I am coming west. Do you think there might be a small place for your old mother in your new life?" Lydia looked up from the letter, her eyes swimming with tears. She saw Boone standing in the doorway, watching her, his expression full of a quiet, questioning love. She held the letter out to him. "We are going to need another room," she said, a laugh bubbling up through her tears. He came and knelt before her, taking the letter and reading it. A slow, warm smile spread across his face. He looked from the page to her, and in his eyes she saw the rest of their lives beginning to take shape. A life built not on the ruins of the past, but on the strong, unshakable foundation of community, justice, and a love that had been chosen, freely and forever, every single day, Winter settled deep into the Ash Creek Valley, a season not of isolation, but of quiet consolidation. The snows that buried the fences and silenced the landscape could not chill the warmth that now bound the community together. The arrival of Sarah Hart on the noon train in early December was an event that, months earlier, would have been a source of gossip and speculation. Now, it was a quiet celebration. Lydia and Boone stood on the platform at Ash Creek, the same platform where she had arrived as a stranger, a piece of a transaction. Today, she stood as a partner, a teacher, a wife, waiting for her mother. When Sarah stepped down from the train, she was an apparition of another world. She was dressed in a fine wool traveling suit, her gloved hands clutching a small, elegant reticule, her eyes wide with a mixture of apprehension and wonder at the raw, white wilderness around her. She looked fragile against the immense backdrop of the snow-covered mountains. Lydia rushed forward and embraced her, a fierce, protective hug. "Mother," she whispered. "You came." "Of course I came," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly as she clung to her daughter. "It seems my daughter has made a habit of being brave. It was time I learned the skill myself." Boone stepped forward, his hat in his hand, his usual quiet awkwardness with strangers softened by a genuine warmth. He took Sarah's valise, his welcome simple and sincere. "We are glad to have you, Mrs. Hart. Our home is yours." The journey to the ranch was a revelation for Sarah. She sat huddled under a thick buffalo robe in the sleigh, her gaze sweeping across the endless, pristine white, the sharp, clean air so different from the damp chill of Boston. When they arrived at the ranch, nestled in the valley like a promise of warmth and safety, Marin Doyle was waiting on the porch. She looked Sarah up and down, a long, assessing gaze that missed nothing, from the fine quality of her coat to the weariness in her eyes. Then Marin did something that astonished Lydia. She smiled, a small cracking of her stern features, and held the door open. "Welcome," she said. "The coffee is hot." The winter months became a tapestry woven from small, meaningful moments. Sarah Hart, who had once presided over elegant Boston tea parties, found a new purpose. She did not learn to mend fences or milk a cow, but she brought her own quiet order to the household. She organized Marin's pantry with a librarian's precision. She helped Eleanor Pike at the schoolhouse, her beautiful cursive a wonder to the children. And in the evenings, her clear voice filled the main room as she read aloud from novels by Dickens and Austen to a rapt audience that often included Hector, Eamon, and any other ranch hand who happened to be nearby. She was not a pioneer, but she was a survivor, and she was learning, finally, how to live. The Calder Ranch House became the heart of the valley. On the coldest nights, when the wind howled and the snow drifted against the doors, the sleighs of the Ortegas or the Sullivans would appear, their occupants bundled and laughing as they came inside to share a pot of stew and the warmth of the fire. The talk was not of fear or hardship, but of the future. They planned the spring planting, discussed the fair rotation of water from the Willow River under the new cooperative's rules, and argued good-naturedly over the best way to breed a stronger line of cattle. The victory over Silas Reddick was rarely mentioned. It was a scar that had healed over, leaving behind not bitterness, but a stronger, more resilient body. The real victory was this: the sound of shared laughter in a warm kitchen, the sight of neighbors working together, the quiet, unshakable knowledge that no one stood alone. It was on one such evening, with the house full of friends and the scent of Marin's cornbread thick in the air, that Lydia felt a strange, fluttering sensation inside her. She placed a hand on her abdomen, her breath catching in her throat. She had suspected for weeks, but this was the first undeniable proof, a tiny, secret message of life. She looked across the room at Boone, who was deep in conversation with Mr. Ortega. He happened to glance up at that moment, his eyes finding hers across the crowded room. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile, and in his answering gaze, full of a deep and steady love, she knew that he understood. Their future was not just a plan on a piece of paper, it was a living, growing thing. A few days later, Lydia saw Marin Doyle sitting by the fire, a pair of knitting needles clicking softly in her gnarled hands. She was working with the softest white wool Lydia had ever seen. On her lap was a tiny, impossibly small baby sweater. Marin did not look up, but a faint, knowing smile touched her lips. "This one will need to be warm," she said gruffly. "Montana winters are no joke." As the snows began to melt, revealing the green promise of the earth beneath, Lydia often walked to the high bluff where Boone had first shown her the valley. She would stand there, one hand resting on her gently swelling belly, and look out at the patchwork of ranches and homesteads. She understood now what Boone had meant by stewardship. It was not about owning the land. It was about tending to the life that it supported. The true victory had not been the moment she pulled the trigger, or the moment the judge handed down his sentence. The victory was in the neat, repaired fences that now marked shared boundaries rather than disputed ones. It was in the clear, life-giving water of the willow, flowing freely for everyone. It was in the schoolhouse, where the children of the valley were learning not just to read, but to think for themselves. Her mother's presence was a daily, gentle reminder of how much had changed. Sarah had found a quiet peace in the valley, a life smaller in scope but infinitely larger in meaning than the one she had left behind. She had rediscovered her own strength, not by fighting battles, but by choosing to plant a new garden in a new land. One evening in early spring, with the first wildflowers dotting the hillsides, Lydia and Boone sat on the porch as the sun went down, painting the sky in shades of violet and rose. The air was soft and cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and new leaves. Inside, through the open door, Lydia could see Boone's old work shirt. She had washed and mended a small tear in the cuff, and now it lay folded neatly on the back of a chair, waiting for the next day's work. It was no longer a symbol of a desperate choice or a turning point. It was just a shirt. It was a part of the simple, durable fabric of their life together, a life built of everyday promises, kept without fanfare. It was the quiet texture of forever. Boone reached over and took her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. He looked out at the valley, at the lights beginning to twinkle in the windows of their neighbors' homes. "It is a good life," he said, his voice full of a quiet wonder. Lydia leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady strength of him. She thought of the fear and loneliness that had brought her here, and the long, hard road they had all traveled since. She thought of the community they had built, the justice they had fought for, and the family they were beginning. A deep, profound peace settled over her. "We did not just survive," she said softly, looking out at the twilight descending over their valley. "We lived right." Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.